Okay, good evening, everybody. Tonight we have Miss Candice with us for another parenting class. My name is Sarah Smith. I'm with Tumwater School District office. And we're going to go ahead and if you have questions, go ahead and raise your hand, or if you want to put it in the chat, I will, if you put it in the chat, I will get Candice's attention and ask away. I hope everybody enjoys. And Miss Candice.
All right. Good evening, you guys. So what we're talking about today is emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is a relatively new area of study. And when I say relatively new, I mean, we really haven't looked at emotional intelligence and the brain until starting around the 1980s. And there was one particular incident called the John Gage. It was an accident. He was a really successful builder and did construction, and had an accident, and a piece of rebar went through his brain. And people were shocked because he seemed to recover completely. There was no problem with his gross motor or his fine motor or his language. But within a 5 or 10 year period, he ended up losing his family, losing his business, and ended up on Skid Row. And there were a couple of other incidences where people had brain tumors in that same part of your brain, the emotional part of your brain, and had the same kinds of outcomes. So they started doing some research about it and recognized that, in fact, your emotional part of your brain has a lot of impact on how well you do in your life. So the first people who started doing research were actually, interestingly enough, insurance companies, which makes sense, and businesses, which makes sense. But since the 1980s, education has done research, psychologists have done research. I mean, we're doing it all. The health is a really important area of research now. So there's all kinds of research out there about emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence now, statistically, what they believe is that emotional intelligence has about 75, depending on which study you look at, 75 to 80% of how well someone does in life has more to do with emotional intelligence. Only about 25% of what we call traditional intelligence, IQ, has an impact of how well you do. So once we started getting this information out about that, then of course you can imagine everybody was jumping on board, because you want to have that kind of emotional intelligence in order to be successful. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So emotional intelligence isn't just having your emotions out there. I remember in the 80s, there would be sort of like, oh, just, if you're having emotion, it was you just sort of said it and you acted however you're saying, and you were supposed to accept that. Like that was really evolved emotional intelligence. And that isn't evolved. So just having it all hanging out there is not emotionally intelligent. Stuffing it, which our parents did, with stuffed emotions, thinking that that looked like you were managing emotions, is also not emotionally intelligent. So what we're going to be talking about tonight are really the 5 components of emotional intelligence, and then sort of breaking those down into areas that you can work with your children and get them more and more emotionally intelligent. Now, the nice thing about emotional intelligence is that, well, a couple things I want to say. One is that oftentimes when we talk about emotional intelligence with parents, parents will say, well, I don't think I'm particularly emotionally intelligent, so I don't know how I'm going to teach my kids. And the nice thing about emotional intelligence is you can learn while you're teaching. So you can be learning right along with them as you're really helping them and coaching them in emotional intelligence. The second thing about emotional intelligence that we found is that, like any other kind of intelligence, there are people who are just innately more emotionally intelligent. Like you may know certain ones of your kids, or You may know friends who have just some natural emotional intelligence. As we talk about, you'll say, oh, they just do that so naturally. And as in other arenas, there are people who do not have that innate ability. So someone can have that innate organic ability in math and be really struggling in emotional intelligence. They can be really amazingly emotionally intelligent, but struggle in terms of literacy, for example. So it's just, again, those individual brains that we have. But the good news about this is that emotional intelligence is one arena that's very, very teachable. And as we start to play with this, I'll give you some examples as we go along so you can see that it is teachable. And in my own experience, not only have I found that is very teachable when I'm working with kids in a classroom, but also I'm noticing that statistically we know that there is one socioeconomic group that is least emotionally intelligent globally, and that is males. And not because I think at all because of the capacity, but because of socialization. So what I've found, which is really reassuring, is that I see no difference in how quickly the boys learn emotional intelligence and the girls learn emotional intelligence. So we know that there isn't a problem with the brain and gender. There's probably a problem with socialization and emotional intelligence, but it's very learnable. And as I work with the kids, that's what I was going to say, is that I literally can watch them become more and more emotionally intelligent. So questions, first of all, about sort of the history or any of that information?
We are clear in the chat and no hands up.
Okay, let's go ahead and go on. All right, so there are basically 5 components of emotional intelligence. They are, first, emotional self-awareness. Now, emotional self-awareness is that ability to recognize your feelings, and all your feelings, both negative and positive. Now, most of you should have gotten a handout that says list of feelings of that person identify. There's about, I don't know, 100, 200 feelings on here. Everybody have that list. So we'll kind of be referring back to it today off and on, because I really want people to understand that the more emotions, you can see that there are many, many emotions that we experience. And the more emotions that you can recognize, and the more quickly you can recognize those emotions, the more likely you are to be able to manage those emotions. So that's why we really work with people to develop their emotional, what we call emotional vocabulary. And so in terms of statistically, the majority of adults use 3 emotions. They are, anybody want to guess? They are happy, mad, and sad. Those are, yeah, everybody got them from Karen. Yes, happy, mad, and sad are the emotions that most adults use. And the problem with this is, number one, 2 of those emotions are what we call secondary emotions. So a secondary emotion is when you're having another emotion, a primary emotion, and you put it into that word. So anger, for example, is what we call a secondary emotion. In and of itself, it doesn't have its own emotional sort of basis. There's always 1 or 2 primary feelings under that. So if you're angry when you see your kids running into the road without looking, or riding their bikes into the road without looking to see if there's a car coming, you're not angry, you're scared. and anger is your secondary emotion. You're not angry when you have a partner who's telling off-colored jokes at a party. You're embarrassed. So, one of the things that we start with right off the bat is helping kids recognize that they have these multitudes of emotions, and the closer they get to that emotion, the more likely they are to be able to manage that emotion. So we literally right off the bat sort of take anger out of their possibilities of expression to help them recognize, we'll bring it back in later, which I'll talk about, but to help them recognize and get better at recognizing those primary emotions. So in that first component of emotional intelligence, it is number one, recognizing you're having an emotion and be able to label that emotion accurately. Now, the first actual recognition of an emotion is what we call a somatic response. So a somatic response is where you feel the emotion in your face. So I will say, for example, close your eyes and remember a time you were really, really embarrassed. And then when you know where you feel that in your body, raise your hand, and I'll have people keep their eyes closed. And you'll see hands slowly come up, some people very quickly, because some people are very in tune with their somatic responses, their body responses. Other people take longer to figure that out. But after a while, I'll say, open your eyes, and then I'll ask questions. Some people will say they feel it in their face. Some people will say embarrassments in their neck. Some people say their stomach hurts. So we don't all have the same somatic response to an emotion, but our job is to figure out where our somatic response is so that when we get that feeling in our stomach or on our face, we know immediately what the emotion is that we're having, can label it and manage it. So that's the first step in terms of recognizing emotional intelligence. Now, the second thing is recognizing body cues and emotions. So this means because you have to recognize them in other people. So that means that you see someone who puts their hands in front of their face, that cue would be telling you they're probably embarrassed. Or if someone covered their ears, that cue would be telling you you're too loud. So we have to learn to recognize cues that help us recognize what someone is feeling emotionally. We have to give the right cue to be able to let people understand the emotion that we have so they respond appropriately. So, what we see with kids who are not emotionally intelligent, for example, is they will feel rejection if they've been told out at recess that somebody doesn't want to play with them. And instead of acting rejected, which would be kind of to drop your shoulders, be a little bit whiny, maybe turn around, walk away in kind of a sad, slow way, which would be a very appropriate response for rejection. Kids who are not very emotionally intelligent will call somebody a name or stomp their feet or say, fine, I don't want to play with you anyway. And what that does, because they gave the wrong signal, is it just affirms for those kids, the other kids, that they don't want to play with them because they're angry and angry kids. And so we start really as early as possible helping kids give the right cue, recognize the emotion, and give the right cue for that emotion so that kids respond differently. When a child responds appropriately to rejection, if we were actually doing a little role play of this tonight, I'll actually pull people up and do it. And when people act appropriately rejected, the other kids kind of look at each other and eventually they'll say things like, we'll play with you next recess, or it's fine, you can play with us. They respond really differently. When someone acts angry when they're feeling rejected, they're sort of like, good riddance, who cares? And they just go back to playing. So That ability to give the right cue and recognize that emotion you're having and give the appropriate cue for that emotion is going to make a huge difference in early socialization. So you're going to recognize you're having emotion, you're going to be able to label it accurately, and then be able to manage that emotion. Now, we're still in the first category of emotional intelligence here. And the second or the third thing I want to talk about in terms of really emotional self-awareness is recognizing that you can have a difficult emotion and be able to have a greater capacity for it. So you can feel overwhelmed but get better at managing that overwhelm, increasing your capacity to manage it. You can be disappointed, but increase your capacity for managing disappointment. So I want people to recognize that emotional intelligence is recognizing all of your emotions and managing all of your emotions. Now, the other piece that you will oftentimes see with people who are struggling with emotional intelligence is they don't recognize they can have more than one emotion at a time. So you can be excited and really anxious about staying overnight at a friend's house. It isn't one or the other. You can have all kinds of feelings about going to a friend's house. So it's the ability to have multiple emotions at one time and recognize that. It's the ability to recognize as quickly as possible through a somatic response what emotion you're having and be able to label it. It's being able to recognize cues that other people give and respond, and be sure that you're giving the right cues so people can respond to you appropriately. So that is just the first level of emotional intelligence. Okay, so questions about that?
Chat is clear and no hands.
Okay, so with that said, what I have seen over the last 10 years or so, which is really positive, is that I see a lot more parents and teachers really working with kids to help them recognize what emotions they're having and be able to actually speak about that emotion accurately, which is really great. However, what I also see is that people get stuck on that first emotional component, emotional intelligence component. They don't know quite what to do from there. So the second component of emotional intelligence is managing your own emotions. And that means that you're going to be also managing emotions in other people. So managing your own emotion means that you're going to recognize an emotion and you're going to know what you need to do to shorten the duration of an uncomfortable emotion or to enhance the duration of a pleasant emotion. So you're going to know how to manage your emotions. So if you're disappointed, for example, you're going to want to be sure, number one, you give the right cue of what disappointment looks like. And it's interesting because sometimes this is where parents start to falter because we had parents that didn't have emotional intelligence themselves or know how to teach it. So one of the common ones I'll see, for example, is I'll hear people say to a child who's disappointed, don't whine. And whining is an appropriate response to the emotion of disappointment. But if we tell them they can't whine, then we see them displace emotion and they'll do things like hit or kick or spit because they've been told they can't whine, but they're having this big emotion and they have to have some way to release that emotion. So you want to remind yourself that you have to be really careful about just not having these generalized things about don't whine. Maybe they won't whine for another emotion, but for disappointment, whining would be appropriate. So it would be dropping your shoulders and kind of dropping your head. sometimes kind of looking down, sometimes sighing. So we have all these emotions that we have these appropriate responses for, the appropriate cues. And I will actually take kids, and you can do this at home with your own families, but I will take kids and we'll do emotional charades. And I'll have the whole class sitting on the floor, and then I'll pick 5 kids at a time and I'll whisper in their ear, embarrassment. And they can't say a word, they just have to do with their body what embarrassment would look like. And then the other kids in the audience have to raise their hand and guess what emotion they're having. Always there's 2 or 3 kids that hands fly up. Those are the kids who are really naturally emotionally intelligent and naturally read those cues. So they really don't struggle that much in terms of interpersonal relationships. And then there are kids who are clueless, even when kids are giving a really appropriate body cue, what that emotion is. But the nice thing about doing it in a group like that is I will then say, as I call on that person who knew, what did you see that made you recognize the person was embarrassed? And they'll say they covered their face, or they turned around, or they turned around and kind of giggled. The other kids who didn't read that cue hear that. So after we do emotional intelligence charades for a while, they will immediately, they've learned the cues, and those hands will fly up just as fast as the kids who knew those cues more organically. So it's very teachable, but charades is a great way of helping kids learn to give the right body cue and read the right body cue. So then there's the whole piece about really managing the emotion. So when you're disappointed, what can you do to make that feeling go away faster? You can talk about it. You can go get centered, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Um, you can re-evaluate what else you could do since what you were going to do isn't going to work out. So you learn to have the skills basically to shorten the duration of that feeling of disappointment. So, excuse me. So that is basically what it means to start to manage your emotions. If you are feeling really frustrated, what does frustration look like? And what can you do to sort of diminish that frustration in terms of how you feel in your body? If you are angry, what are the anger actions you can use that don't destroy property, don't hurt other people, don't hurt yourself? And you can use those, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So you start to learn to manage. Then you have to really recognize when your emotions are getting in the way of you or impairing your ability to to do things or to communicate. Then you have to recognize how to manage other people's emotions. And so we grew up where some of you may remember this, that in early emotional intelligence kinds of trainings, people would say, well, I'm not responsible for your emotions. Those are your emotions. I'm not responsible. And that really confused people and really undermined good interpersonal relationships, because there is truth in that we are not responsible for somebody necessarily having another emotion, having an emotion, but we are responsible in managing that emotion when we're around someone else. So a good example of this is we'll have somebody who is behind us in the car, and they were wanting to get around us, and they're honking their horn and flashing their lights and clearly manifesting a lot of frustration and probably rage. Well, when they go around you and drive by, it's not very emotionally intelligent to flip them off. You're going to enrage them more. An emotionally intelligent person would probably look away, not engage them at all. Some people would say, to say something smarty or wave at them. But again, if you wave in a smart alecky way at somebody who's already enraged, even though you didn't enrage them, they're going to react in a way that would be not to your advantage. So it's learning to manage other people's emotions, not that you're responsible for their emotions, but managing the emotions they have. And then the third is recognizing when you have an improper emotional management. So you're doing things like maybe doing self-harm when you're feeling disappointed in yourself. You'll have kids who will hit themselves or bite themselves. That would be an inappropriate action in managing that emotion. So basically, first two components, recognizing and being able to accurately identify emotions, self-awareness, emotional self-awareness. Number two component is managing emotions in yourself and in other people. Okay, so questions about that?
The chat is clear.
Okay.
Hands.
All right. So we're moving on to the third component of emotional intelligence. The third component of emotional intelligence is maximizing emotional processing. Now, this is really interesting because one of the things that happened with John Gage is he was no longer able to, one, manage his emotions or manage emotions in other people. But the other thing that was really big that they recognized pretty quickly when he went back to work was he was unable to make decisions. So we now know a couple of things as we've done research. We know a couple of different things. We know that decision making involves both parts of the brain, your sort of intellectual part of the brain, the linear logical part of the brain, and the emotional part of your brain. The first assumption was, of course, that it was your linear logical part of your brain that you processed first, and then your emotional brain. And we realized that very quickly after starting to do research on decision making and processing, that actually information goes through your emotional brain first, then into your linear logical part of your brain. So we had to very quickly change the messaging we got. So one of the things that came up a lot in terms of emotional intelligence and gender was that women were very quick to really have those gut feelings, to be intuitive. They were taught to value being intuitive, whereas males were taught to be very linear about their thinking. And so we realized for business, for health, for education, that we really had to get busy and get back and really get people again to recognize that emotional response in terms of a decision was not only superfluous and got in the way of logic, it was the first really valuable way that our brains would process information and then go to our linear logical part of our brain. So, for example, if we have small children now, we really want to get them to listen to those gut feelings as quickly as possible. So we'll do things like in a grocery store, we'll be in line and a small child might look up to their parent and say, "I don't like that man behind me." Now, right away, what most people would have done in the past is immediately say, "Don't say that, that's not nice." One. Or two, why, they're really nice. They seem like really nice people. We would counter that gut feeling. Now, what we do is we recognize that that gut feeling may not have come from a place of really intellectual understanding, but from a place of unfamiliarity. And so it might have been an elderly man with a really wrinkly face and sticky out ears and a big nose. And it's unfamiliar. That look was unfamiliar. And so they got that gut feeling, that intuitive feeling that something wasn't, quotes, right. So the appropriate response would be to keep them, learning to recognize that feeling would be to say, if you're not comfortable, stand by me. In other words, I don't want you to ignore that gut feeling because that gut feeling may be really important to you in another circumstance. Then later, after we're out of that context, you would then go to the linear logical part of the brain and you might say, what didn't you like about that person? And they might say they had really weird skin, or they had really big ears, or something. You'd say, oh, that is what happens as you grow older. That's what somebody who is elderly looks like. You might look at pictures so that it becomes familiar. The next time they will recognize that, the familiarity, and they won't get that gut feeling. But you don't want to turn off that gut feeling. You want them to learn, if they have a gut feeling, take action, because we know that's where it's processed first. Then you think about it when you get a chance and figure out if that was an action you needed to take. So you will hear over and over again, for example, stories of women who have said after a rape that they had a gut feeling, but they didn't act on it because they wanted to be nice. And so, one of the things that we really have to work on in terms of female gender is all the socialization about being nice and ignoring gut feelings. So, we're working with both genders to redefine what it looks like to respond to gut feelings. Now, the other thing that we know is that we do know that it takes both part of the brain to make good decisions. We also know that it's important for us to learn what emotions enhance our decision making and when, and what emotions hinder good decision making and when. So, for example, when we are really overwhelmed or feel really highly emotionally triggered, we flood. Flooding is when you shoot out adrenaline and your brain goes into fight or flight, and you kind of have that Charlie Brown kind of moi, 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 moi is all you hear. And so that isn't it. When you're flooded is not a good time to make decisions because you are not getting the input. Your brain is not processing the input of what's coming in. So you need to learn to it takes about 20 or 30 minutes for your body to reabsorb that adrenaline where you can start processing again. So we know we have to stop, take 20 or 30 minutes, wait for that emotion, that adrenaline to get reabsorbed, and then try to get that um, information again to make a decision. And we may even have to figure out that we may have that emotional response. So maybe we need that information in writing, or maybe we can get that information after we've processed it a little bit first, in small doses. So you're going to learn how to make decisions and what emotions enrich decision making and which emotions hinder decision making. Okay, so questions about the third component, which is the intellectual processing.
Looks like we have a question from Karen. What advice do you have for parents feeling embarrassed by a child's comment in the context of honoring gut feelings?
Okay, that's a great question because I think it's a lot of the reason we say the wrong things. Um, as kids get older, one of the emotionally intelligent behaviors we're going to work on are social graces. So as we talk about this, remember that, this is an evolved process like anything else. You start by reading, by learning some sight words or learning to sound out a few words, and then you get better and better and better. Emotional intelligence is no different. You get more and more sophisticated in your emotional intelligence. So small children, luckily it's the smallest children who tend to do that because that's their earliest emotionally intelligent responses. As they get older and we start working on some of the other skills, which the next arena we're talking about is that next skill of emotional intelligence, next component, you'll have less embarrassment because they will have learned to be more emotionally intelligent. But that's why I'm saying when they say something like that can be embarrassing, it's best to say something neutral, like, if you're not comfortable, come stand by me. Or if it was someone, for example, in a wheelchair, you might say something like, he's in a wheelchair. You've not seen a wheelchair before, huh? So that you're talking out loud to that person. But to shush your child actually makes people more uncomfortable. Is everybody clear about this? People will say, well, I just shush them. And I'm like, yeah, but shushing them is almost more shaming when that kind of thing happens than if you were just to talk out loud about what you think they may be experiencing. So remind yourself it's early coaching. It gets better as they get older and more emotionally intelligent, and we work on that emotional intelligence. And shushing is actually more shaming for the person they're talking about than if we would talk out loud in a neutralizing way. Okay. Anybody else around that?
Karen says thank you.
Okay, the next one is related to what Karen was talking about, which is the fourth component of emotional intelligence is developing empathy. Now, this one is really interesting because this is a very sophisticated, emotionally intelligent behavior. And we have actually undermined our kids' capability in this last generation or two. Not maliciously by any means, but because we have been so child focused in our parenting, we have also really wanted to protect them from having uncomfortable emotions. So, do you remember in the first component, I said it's incredibly important that your kids have the capacity to be able to recognize and manage both comfortable and uncomfortable emotions. And that didn't happen. We really didn't want our kids to feel rejection. We didn't want them to be disappointed. We tried to not have them be uncomfortable. We did what we could to keep them from being overwhelmed. And so as we start to take away these emotional experiences, what we also are doing is undermining empathy, because empathy is a very complex, emotionally intelligent behavior. It is, first of all, being able to recognize in someone else, because we read the cue, what emotion that person was having from their emotional cue. Then we had to bring it back to ourselves and recognize what it felt like in our own body to be rejected. And then after recognizing that rejection feeling and recognizing it wasn't our emotion, it was their emotion, knowing how to appropriately respond, to the person who was having that emotion. So it's all three of the first components we talked about. It's recognizing cues, it's recognizing how emotions feel in our body, it's recognizing that it's not our emotion but someone else's, and how to respond appropriately to someone else's emotion. So that is a very sophisticated, emotionally intelligent behavior. And I will have parents of 3 and 4-year-olds who'll say, I don't feel like my kids have any empathy. And I'll say, number one, they don't have enough life experience yet to have a really strong, emotionally intelligent development of empathy. You have to have some life experience, including negative and uncomfortable emotions, in order to really fully develop empathy. So this is where I've really had to work with the adults in the last couple generations to really be more about helping their kids learn how to manage an emotion, even if it's uncomfortable, rather than to stop them from having an emotion. Because by stopping them from having an emotion, we're interfering with the development of them becoming empathic human beings. Okay, so questions about this? So it's very interesting because this is the first generation where we've really heard a lot of adults, both teachers, parents, in other settings, where adults will say, I don't feel like the kids in this generation have much empathy or much compassion. And they actually aren't wrong about that. This has been one, like I said, one area that I think our kids can have some catch up to do in terms of learning how to be more empathic, compassionate people. Okay. All right. So anything about that fourth component? Okay. The fifth component is actually the most emotionally intelligent component. This is that ability to guide an interaction with someone. It's that ability to inspire people. It's the ability to convince people of things or to persuade people. It's like really emotionally intelligent people are good at really managing the emotions to their benefit of other people and to other people's benefit, ideally. So when people become incredibly emotionally intelligent, if they are not also taught to be morally intelligent, which we aren't going to have time to talk about tonight, then they become dangerous. Is everybody clear about this? They become the charismatic people, the Jim Jones, the people, the Hitlers, the people who basically influence and inspire people in immoral ways to their own advantage. So as we work on emotionally intelligence, on emotional intelligence with our children, and it is important because it is 75 to 80% of how well they'll do in life, we also have to be very conscious about working on moral intelligence so that we don't create those really dysfunctional adult responses. Okay, so questions about the 5 components. That's the 5 components of emotional intelligence.
Seeing that the chat is clear.
Okay, all right. So you should have a sheet that says concepts useful in developing emotional intelligence. So it's one thing to understand that emotional intelligence are these 5 components and they get more and more complex as we get more emotionally intelligent. But it's really hard to sort of know how to work with people, and in this case with children, to really develop those components. So these concepts are sort of broken down in a way that you can sort of say to yourself, okay, this is how we start. So with a 3-year-old, with a 5-year-old, with a 6-year-old, these are some of the tools we'll use to teach them to become more emotionally intelligent. I have a question. Somebody looks like there was a pop-up.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted myself. About the handout. Let me look over the
Did you not get the concepts one?
No, I got all 3 of them. Dana, it looks like she said she didn't receive it. I will email it to you tomorrow, Dana. I have your email address here on my registry.
Okay. And I'll probably say I'm slow enough, Dana, too, that you can write them down as we go. So, okay, so the first component is just identifying feelings. That's why I gave you this really, really specific feeling list. And the best way to really work on that is to develop your own emotional vocabulary so that you're labeling emotions in yourself and in your kids. And the way I usually have people work on that is I'll say, pick out 5 emotions that you know you have pretty regularly or your kids have pretty regularly, and label those emotions really all week long for a week or two. Then pick out 5 more. Within a 5 or 6 week period, you can have a 30-word vocabulary, emotional vocabulary. And so you're just going to little by little help your kids develop that vocabulary and self-awareness, as well as develop it in yourself. Then you're going to do things like work on their somatic responses. So you'll say, oh, your cheeks are really red. I can tell that embarrassed you. Or you'll say, oh, my throat feels so tight. It's like that's what happens when I get anxious. Or, I'm really excited and it just makes makes me tingle when I'm excited. You'll talk about your somatic responses, you'll label theirs. And oftentimes with young children, you'll see that they'll actually touch the part of their body when they're giving a cue that is actually the part of the body that they're having their somatic response in. So, for example, overwhelmed, a lot of people grab their head when they're feeling overwhelmed. They'll go, ugh. And that's because generally overwhelmed is that sense of just having too much to think about or too much to process. And so it feels like it's in your head. Some kids will hold their stomach when they talk about having to do something they're anxious about. So we'll help them recognize where that somatic response is. Then the next thing we want to work on are body cues, both giving the right body cue and reading body cues. And that's where the charades come in. That's where modeling is really important. So when you're having an emotion, that you might label your emotion and exaggerate it a little bit, like drop your shoulders a little bit more than you ordinarily would when you're disappointed, and kind of whine as you say it. To really be clear, it's like that little bit of whining and dropping your shoulders is what disappointment looks like, or overwhelmed is grabbing your head, or fiddling with your fingers is feeling anxious. So you'll try to give cues and you'll probably try to read cues. But charades are a really good way of doing this. And it's fun for kids to actually work on body cues with charades. So the other thing you'll do is in public settings, you'll start coaching your kids. So some of your kids will just automatically, for example, recognize that their spatial needs are different than other people's spatial needs. And if somebody backs up, they recognize they were standing too close, and they might back up even a little more from them, but they certainly would not go towards them. Kids who don't have that natural ability to read cues, for example, if somebody backed up because they were standing too close, that child who didn't read the cue might actually grab them to keep them from going back away from them, which is because they were feeling rejected or dismissed, when in fact that cue was, you are in my space, you are standing too close. So, so you're gonna, if you saw that, you would say, James, Joey's telling you you're standing too close to him. Joey's backing up because you're standing too close to him. Or later, if you thought it was to be too embarrassing in the situation, you'd say, James, when somebody backs up, they're telling you you're too much in their space. So you're going to be coaching them after they start to read cues. You're going to be coaching them so that they learn very overtly that certain cues people give are telling them what they want from their behavior. Okay, so that's reading and giving body cues. So there's the third. The fourth component, your concept you're going to work on, is differentiation. That's the ability to recognize difference without judgment. When kids can learn to recognize difference without judgment, they do much better in interpersonal communication, much better in problem solving. So what we will do is we'll do little games where I will put a tray of things out on a tray for kids, and I'll say, pass the tray around. And I just say, pass it, just pass it. Don't stop and look at it. Just whatever you see in the first glance as you're passing. And then I'll grab the tray and I'll cover it up. Then I'll say to the kids, what did you see? And one of them might say, I saw a pencil and a paper clip. Another child might say, I saw an eraser and a hair curler. Another one might say, I saw a Pokemon card and something else. And I'll point out as I pull the tray, the cover off the tray, that they were all right. Nobody was wrong, but we see things differently. And then we start talking about, why might someone have seen a screwdriver? Well, because their dad is in construction. Why did somebody recognize that paper roll as a hair roller? Because their grandma uses hair rollers, and that looked like the thing their grandma used. So we start pointing out why people see differences and recognizing difference without judgment. Then very quickly, even in a kindergarten class, I will start saying things like to the kids, like, you may really love peas and somebody else may really dislike the taste of peas. You may really love the color pink and somebody else's worst color is pink. So we just start talking about differences. Then I'll start talking about, you may have thought that that ball hit a line in Foursquare and the other person thought it hit outside the line. So that within a few weeks of working on differentiation, that ability to recognize difference without judgment, I'll have kids who will come in after recess if I'm there, and they'll say to me, I told Joey that the ball was on the line. He said it was outside the line, and I said, well, let's just do it again. Just differentiation. They'll start to actually even use the word and recognize it as a way of resolving conflict. So differentiation is the next one you'll start working on early. Respect is a behavior, an emotionally intelligent behavior, and there are basically 4 components of respectful behavior. The 4 components of respectful behavior are, if you want to write these down, interest in the point of view of another other than your own. It's easy to be interested in the same point of view, but interested in the point of view of another other than your own. The second one is trust in the ability of another. Say it again. Trust in the ability of another. The third component is recognize and accept others have feelings different than your own. Recognize and accept others have feelings different than your own, even sharing the same experience. So, for example, a child could trip and fall, and they would feel embarrassed, and their friend might have found it humorous. They shared the same experience, but they had a different emotional response to that experience. So now you're also talking about differentiation. The fourth component of respect is recognizing and owning your part of a problem. Recognizing and owning your part of a problem. So when we start working on respect, we, number one, of course, have to be sure we're really modeling those behaviors as much as possible to children. We have to be sure that we talk about it as a behavior, and a behavior of what we call integrity. Like if you're a person of integrity, you treat people respectfully, regardless of how they treat you. And so that's the 4 behaviors we're talking about. And then we expect them to be able to be held accountable when they are being disrespectful. Okay, so let me say the 4 components of respect again, or the 4 steps. 1, trust in the ability of another. The second is interest in the point of view of another other than your own. The third is recognizing and owning your part of a problem. The fourth is recognizing and accepting others have feelings different than your own, even sharing the same experience. Okay, so that is one of the concepts of emotional intelligence. Okay, the next one is empathy. And we talk again, I just want to talk about what empathy is again. Empathy is recognizing an emotion in someone, and you recognize that emotion because they gave you a cue that helped you recognize that emotion. Bring it back into yourself. Remember what it feels like to have that emotion, but also be able to be clear it's not your emotion. Then to respond appropriately, manage that person's emotion after you've recognized it. That's empathy.
Miss Candice,
Yes.
I'm sorry, did you see, it looks like, is it Tana? Could you list the components of respect? I know you went over some material, but I don't know if you saw her question. I just wanted to touch base on
I think that's what she was looking for. Those are the 4 pieces of respect. Those last 4 I said.
Okay. She said her phone froze. So
Okay. Do you want me? Let me say it again for you then. Okay, ready? Interest in the point of view of another other than your own. Trust in the ability of another. Recognize and own your part of a problem. Recognize and accept others have feelings different than your own, even sharing the same experience. Did she get those? Tana, did you get those?
she said thank you.
Yes, great.
We're good.
Okay. All right. So the next one is compassion. Now, compassion is sort of the more sophisticated form of empathy. So you have to develop empathy quite a bit before you can have compassion. And then compassion is that ability to not necessarily have the same experience, but share the emotional experience because you recognize it. So, for example, we could be compassionate about someone losing a child, even though, excuse me, even though we've never lost a child, but we have lost a pet or we have lost another family member, and we know what that grief felt like, so that we have compassion for the grief they may be feeling. So that is again where you have to have those emotional experiences to become a fully developed, compassionate person. Okay. And this is the whole thing about empathy and compassion in terms of our role as adults, is to be sure that we are allowing our children to have their full emotional life experiences. Okay. The next one is centering. Now, centering, some people call it centering, grounding, but centering is an emotionally intelligent way of managing emotions. Centering is that ability to bring yourself back, excuse me, got a tickle, to bring yourself back to a place of well-being after we've been emotionally strung out. Excuse me, I'm gonna have to go get some water. I'll be right back. Hang on here. I'm back. Sorry, you guys, too much talking and not enough fluid. Okay, so centering is that ability to get back to that place of emotional well-being after we've had an uncomfortable emotion. And so an emotional intelligent person knows that centering is a way of helping them get to that place and shorten the duration of that uncomfortable emotion. Now, most of us have some form of centering that is our preferential way of centering. So some people are oral centers and they eat to get centered, or they bite their fingernails. They're oral centers. Some of you are auditory centers and you get centered by listening to music or nature sounds, or some of us are kinesthetic centers and you center by fiddling with your hair or wiggling your legs or rocking in back and forth in your chair. Some of you are, what we leave out, tactile centers, where some kids who are tactile centers will like play with something soft or touch silky clothes. Those are the ones who had their blankies when they were growing up, that kind of thing. So we generally use all of our senses as a way of centering. And what we want to help our kids develop is that the more things they have in their sensory toolbox or their centering repertoire, the more likely they are to be able to get back to that place of well-being, no matter what their emotion is or where that emotion is being experienced. So, for example, some people who are kinesthetic centers go out and shoot baskets to get to that place of well-being. Well, if you're in a classroom, you can't go out and shoot a basket. So what would it look like to get centered in that kind of setting if you're kinesthetic? or adding that, like, yes, kinesthetic is my first one, but my second one is tactile. And, I could just have something, wear a certain outfit that I could rub on my fingers on my coat, or have a ring, since I'm kinesthetic, one of the rings that you can twist, that kind of thing. So you want to develop as many ways to get centered as possible. That's definitely an emotionally intelligent ability. Okay, the next one is conflict resolution. So it's recognizing how to resolve conflicts. And that starts with, first of all, that whole piece about differentiation. It has to do with respect. If you have developed respect and differentiation, then conflict resolution is much, much easier to actually accomplish. Then they have to have, what are the steps of conflict resolution? Really being able to identify what the problem is and to verbalize it, to be able to say which and to say what it is that you're needing or need changed, and the other person has to be able to say what they're needing and need change. So what we see is that we're getting kids who are really good at conflict in terms of up to that place of where they have to listen to the other person's point of view. So again, I think in this generation, we've been very child focused, where we haven't really focused as much on them listening to people as we have about being sure they had a voice. So when you work on conflict, you want to be sure that they have all that information, including that they need to listen to somebody else's point of view. Then you come up with the best solution you have in the moment. Some people don't resolve conflict because they're looking for the perfect solution, and there isn't a perfect solution. So you pick the best thing you have in the moment, and then you may revisit it later and refine it later. So you're just going to teach these little steps of successful conflict resolution. Okay, so conflict resolution is moving towards that more sophisticated part of emotional intelligence. Then there's also anger management. So in anger management, number one, anger isn't a feeling, a primary feeling, it's a secondary feeling. There's always a feeling or other feelings, more than one feeling under there. And our job is to recognize what those primary feelings are under that anger response. Then it's also learning that there's anger, the feeling, which is a signal you're having feelings, and anger actions. And anger, the feeling, is never bad. Anger, the feeling, is just that signal. It's what gives us the signal that we need to figure out what we're feeling. Anger actions, on the other hand, are not always good. So there are anger actions that are inappropriate. Anything that hurts people, or anything that destroys property, or anything that hurts ourselves, is not an acceptable anger action. So anger actions have to be something that doesn't do any of those things. But sometimes we have to have a release in order to get unflooded and get centered. So we have to know what are those anger actions that we need to figure out what's underneath that response. And that could be stomping your foot. That could be, big sighs. Or as when kids are small, they stick their tongues out, and people say, well, that's not acceptable. And I'm like, I don't really care at 6. They're going to get more and more emotionally intelligent. And at 6, sticking their tongue out doesn't destroy property, hurt them, or hurt other people. Hitting would, kicking would, calling names would. So sticking your tongue out is sort of a more sophisticated, appropriate response to releasing. And as we get older, we just get more and more appropriate about that. Okay, so anger management would be an arena to work on. Then there's confronting, and this one is more sophisticated. Now we're starting to move towards that inspiring, managing other people, etc. So confronting, first of all, is you have to be able to confront someone in order to get to problem solving. And in confronting, what most people grew up with the model of somebody had to be right and somebody had to be wrong, and by golly, you weren't going to be the one who was wrong. So in confronting, you have to know, number one, don't confront someone unless you need have or need relationship with them. So we don't need to confront strangers about things because we don't have or need relationship with them. But if you have or need relationship with someone, there are 4 components of how to confront people. They are, number one, that you clearly state what it is that you're needing or wanting, that you are conscious of not undermining somebody else's self-esteem, that you are recognizing that your job is to maximize their cooperation and minimize their defensiveness. And then, of course, looking at that whole thing where we started off saying that you don't need to confront if you don't need or want relationship. The whole idea is you use those 4 things the way you do because your whole idea is the goal is to maintain relationship. If you didn't need relationship, you wouldn't need to confront. So the 4 components are, again, information, maximize cooperation, minimize defensiveness, maintain the other person's self-esteem. Okay. Then reframing, again, getting more sophisticated. Reframing is to hear something and reframe it in a way to be solvable and or manageable. So instead of saying, for example, to a partner, I really want a boat, but we don't have enough money in savings, that's not solvable. But I really want a boat and we don't have enough money in savings, makes it a solvable, reframed statement where then we can talk about, could we sell a car? Could we rent one? Could we? So just by even changing a but to an and, we can reframe something to be more manageable and solvable. Presentation is recognizing that your tone of your voice, your body language, I'm trying to think, facial expressions, all of that has an impact on how someone is going to see you and respond to you. So it has some to do with cueing. It has some to do with differentiation. It has some to do with being sure that you are respectful. So when we talk about presentation, people oftentimes are not conscious that it's more presentation than the words they speak that has an impact on people. And then stress management is a more sophisticated, emotionally intelligent behavior that would include centering, but it would also include what else do you do to relieve stress or to minimize stress. Communication skills, which we have and will, again, probably spend 2 hours talking about communication skills, but communication skills are an emotionally intelligent behavior. And then the last one is that we don't talk about a lot, but should, are social graces. So social graces are a form of emotional intelligence. Social graces are those behaviors that we have that are sort of what we call the cultural glue vocabulary. They're the things in any culture that are the behaviors that no matter where you are the common language. So social graces, for example, in our culture would be saying hello when someone when they walk in, a greeting, saying goodbye when someone leaves, opening doors, knowing how to, for people, knowing how to answer a phone, saying please and thank you, knowing how to, the table manners are in our culture. All of those things are social graces. And there was a generation or two in past, I'd say almost two now, where because it was such a big part of people's coaching by parents, and oftentimes not coached in particularly gentle or kind way, that we totally rejected it and started saying that that was all kind of bullshit stuff and you didn't need to do it, not recognizing that we put ourselves and our children in a position of not having that common language that made new situations and new people more comfortable and ourselves more comfortable because it was the common language. It also kept us from stopping and learning that other cultures also had specific social graces, and by not recognizing our own, we didn't look for or recognize them in other cultures, and we're much more likely, as we started to become more global, to become more offensive because we didn't value or learn those differences in social graces. So we've come back around to recognizing how important social graces are in terms of emotional intelligence and how well someone does in life. So that's kind of just a really general list of sort of the things you would be working on as you're starting to work on emotional intelligence with your kids. So a lot of information. Questions? Anyone?
It's like the chat is clear.
You need a few more minutes to process. Still okay, Sarah?
It looks like we are clear.
Okay. So any questions in general before we go for the night? Seem to be good?
Karen says, thank you very much. This was very helpful.
Good. All right. Sounds like we're good. Okay. Thank you guys for coming tonight. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, Miss Candice. You take care.
I will. Bye, you guys.
Bye-bye.